The first time I saw the note taped to my front door, I thought it was just another HOA reminder, the kind that usually went out when someone forgot trash day or left their holiday decorations up too long. But the bold red letters across the top made it clear this wasn't a casual request. It was a formal notice, direct and sharp, dripping with the kind of authority only someone desperate for control could craft. The letter accused me of violating community safety standards by keeping a dangerous animal on the premises. My eyes lingered on those words longer than I expected. I looked down at Max, my German shepherd, sitting faithfully by my side. His calm brown eyes met mine, his tail giving a slow, lazy wag. Dangerous? This dog had saved my life. More than once, both literally, and in ways harder to put into words. Max wasn't just a pet. He was my service animal, trained to detect and respond to medical episodes that could leave me incapacitated, if not addressed quickly. His training had taken years. His focus was unmatched. The idea that someone could see him as a threat was laughable, until I remembered where I lived. The neighborhood had always been quiet, an upper-middle-class patchwork of manicured lawns, brick-front homes, and driveways polished like showroom floors. But like many neighborhoods with a homeowners association, peace was more about appearances than actual harmony. And there was one person in particular who made sure those appearances were enforced to the letter. Valerie Karen Whitford. Valerie wasn't just a board member. She was the board. She chaired meetings, sent out notices, and somehow found the time to monitor every yard, porch, and driveway like a hawk circling for prey. I'd seen her in action, marching up to strangers at block parties to scold them about parking violations, snapping photos of kids' bikes left on sidewalks, even measuring the height of grass in a neighbor's front yard. Max had caught her attention the first week I moved in. She spotted us walking down the street, her eyes narrowing as if the very shape of his ears violated some unwritten rule. She didn't say anything then, but the way she lingered, the subtle shake of her head, it told me I'd already been filed into her mental category of problems to solve. Over the next month, the tension simmered. Every time I took Max out, I'd catch her watching from her porch or through her bay window, her phone in hand as if ready to document some imagined wrongdoing. I ignored it. People like her thrived on confrontation, and I wasn't about to feed into that. But ignoring her didn't make her go away. The first complaint came by email. It accused me of having an aggressive breed in a family neighborhood and suggested I rehome Max for everyone's safety. I replied with the bare facts. Max was a service animal protected by federal law, specifically under the Americans with Disabilities Act. I even attached a copy of his certification. The response was silence, which I naively took as the end of it. Then the notice appeared on my door. This one was more than a suggestion. It claimed I had 7 days to remove Max from the property or face escalating fines. It referenced HOA bylaws that I later discovered didn't even exist in the association's handbook. It was, in short, a direct attack dressed up in official language. I knew Valerie had written it. The phrasing was hers, all sharp edges and veiled threats. The signature at the bottom, on behalf of the board, was a dead giveaway. The rest of the board was barely active. Valerie was the only one who treated HOA work like a full-time job. For a moment, I considered just ignoring the notice. Max was legal. His presence was protected. They had no authority to enforce this. But then I thought about the kind of person I was dealing with. If I ignored her, she'd just escalate. She'd push harder, dig deeper, find some other way to make life miserable until she got her way. The choice wasn't whether to respond. It was how. That night, as Max lay at my feet, I started gathering everything I'd need. Documentation of his training, medical records explaining why I needed him, every piece of correspondence from the HOA since I moved in. I even started a log of every time I saw Valerie watching us or heard from a neighbor that she'd been asking questions about me. It wasn't paranoia, it was preparation. The next day, the whispers started. Neighbors I barely knew approached me with awkward small talk, their eyes darting to Max as if expecting him to lunge at them. Someone mentioned that Valerie had been telling people a dangerous police dog lived on my property. Another said she claimed Max had snapped at a child during a walk. A blatant lie, since I never let him interact with strangers without my direction. It was clear she wasn't just trying to remove Max. She was building a case in the court of neighborhood opinion, hoping to turn the community against me before I had a chance to defend myself. By the end of the week, I'd received 2 more letters, both increasingly aggressive, both threatening fines that grew in size like some grotesque countdown. The final one gave me 48 hours to comply, before further action would be taken. That phrase, further action, sat in my stomach like a lead weight. I knew it was meant to intimidate me, but it also told me something important. She was about to make her move, and that meant it was time for me to make mine. What Valerie didn't know, what most people in this neighborhood didn't know, was that I wasn't fighting this battle alone. I had someone in my corner who knew exactly how to dismantle this kind of petty authoritarian overreach. My lawyer was more than just a legal expert. He specialized in disability rights cases, and he'd gone toe-to-toe with organizations, far bigger and nastier than a suburban. So, when I called him and laid out the situation, I could practically hear the satisfaction in his voice. This was exactly the kind of case he loved. Over the next several days, we worked quietly. He drafted letters citing federal statutes, ADA protections, and case law that made it abundantly clear the HOA had no legal ground to stand on. He compiled a timeline of their harassment, backed by my logs and the statements from a few brave neighbors who were willing to tell the truth about Valerie's lies. Every time I walked past Valerie's house with Max at my side, I could feel the storm building. She thought she was cornering me. She thought the fines, the rumors, the public shaming would force me to cave. But she didn't see the trap I was setting. She'd mistaken silence for weakness when, in reality, it was the sound of me loading every piece of evidence into a weapon. She couldn't defend against a federal lawsuit. And soon, she'd find out just how dangerous it was to pick a fight with someone who knew the law better than she did. The first volley was about to be fired. Chapter 2, The First Strike. The letter went out on a Tuesday. It wasn't just any letter. It was a precision-crafted piece of legal artillery designed to hit the HOA right where they were weakest. My lawyer had spent 3 days fine-tuning every line, citing statute after statute, stacking federal protections like bricks in a wall they couldn't climb over. At the top, in bold, was the citation, Americans with Disabilities Act, Title II and the 3, Federal Protection for Service Animals. It laid out in unflinching detail that any attempt to remove Max from my property, restrict his access to neighborhood spaces, or levy fines because of his breed or size was not only unenforceable, it was illegal. Below that came the evidence. My medical documentation verified by my physician, Max's service animal certification and training history, copies of every HOA letter they'd sent, each one more aggressive than the last, screenshots of Valerie's defamatory emails to other residents, statements from neighbors who had overheard her lying about Max's behavior. And then came the hook, a clear warning that, if they did not immediately rescind all notices, remove any record of violation from their files, and issue a written apology within 7 days, we would be filing a federal lawsuit seeking damages for discrimination, harassment, and defamation. The envelope wasn't addressed to Valerie. Personally, it went to the official HOA board mailing address, as per the association's own bylaws. That was deliberate. If Valerie thought she could quietly bury this, she was mistaken. My lawyer knew it would be read by the treasurer, the secretary, and anyone else on the board before she could spin. The narrative. I dropped it into the certified mail slot myself. As the envelope slid out of sight, I felt the tension that had been building in my chest begin to ease. For the first time since the first notice appeared, the pressure was no longer all on me. The momentum was shifting. The HOA board met once a month in the community clubhouse, a brick building tucked near the subdivision's entrance. That week's meeting was just 3 days after the letter landed in their mailbox. I didn't attend, not because I wasn't curious, but because I didn't need to. I knew the contents of that letter would do the talking for me. The next morning, I started hearing the ripples. A neighbor stopped me on my walk to say the meeting had gotten heated. Another mentioned Valerie had left early, red-faced and tight-lipped. Word spread quickly that the treasurer, a mild-mannered man named Greg, had read portions of my lawyer's letter aloud to the room. Some members of the board had looked visibly uncomfortable. It wasn't hard to guess why. Most HOA board members were volunteers not trained in legal warfare. They didn't want to be personally liable for a lawsuit. Valerie, however, thrived on conflict until that conflict threatened her own security. 2 days later, the first official response arrived. It was on HOA letterhead, signed not by Valerie but by the association's secretary. The tone was different, polite, measured. It acknowledged receipt of my lawyer's letter and said the board would review the matter in consultation with legal counsel. Notably absent was any mention of fines, violations, or deadlines. It was the first crack in their armor, but Valerie wasn't about to surrender quietly. Later that afternoon, I caught her standing at the edge of my driveway, phone in hand, snapping photos of Max through the fence as he lounged in the sun. She didn't speak to me, didn't even acknowledge my presence when I stepped outside. She just clicked away, as if collecting evidence she could twist into something damning. I knew exactly what she was doing, trying to provoke me into an outburst she could use against me. But I'd already learned that in HOA disputes, the person who loses their composure first loses. So I simply noted the time, the date, and her actions in my log. Every petty stunt she pulled now became another brick in the case I was building. Meanwhile, my lawyer worked behind the scenes, sending a follow-up request for the HOA's official bylaws and enforcement procedures. Under state law, they were required to provide them within a set time frame. If they failed, it would become yet another point in my favor. When the bylaws finally arrived, the most telling thing about them was what they didn't say. There was no provision giving the HOA authority to ban specific dog breeds, no section allowing fines for community safety without documented incidents, and certainly no clause empowering the board to override federal law. It was a house of cards, one that Valerie had been bluffing with for years. Still, she doubled down. Anonymous complaints appeared in my mailbox, unsigned but clearly written by the same hand. They accused me of allowing Max to menace children, of neglecting him, of letting him roam unleashed in the neighborhood. All lies easily disproven. But the intention was obvious, to wear me down through volume, hoping I'd tire of fighting. But here's the thing about fighting. When you're in the right, you don't get tired. You get focused. By the end of the week, my lawyer had drafted the initial complaint. It was ready to file in federal court if the HOA didn't meet our demands. The damages we were seeking weren't just symbolic. They were enough to hurt. Enough to make every board member think twice before backing Valerie's crusade. The deadline for their response was Monday. That weekend, the neighborhood felt different. People I'd barely spoken to before started greeting me in passing, some even giving small, knowing nods when they saw Max trotting at my side. It was as if the tide of public opinion was shifting, quietly but steadily away from Valerie's narrative. On Sunday evening, as the sun set behind the rooftops, I stood on my porch with Max at my feet. The air was cool, the street quiet. Somewhere down the block, I saw Valerie's silhouette in her window, watching us like she always did. But this time, I didn't feel the weight of her scrutiny, because I knew what was coming next. By the time Monday rolled around, the HOA would have to decide, back down and admit they'd overstepped, or dig in and face the full force of a federal lawsuit. Either way, the balance of power had shifted, and for the first time since this started, I wasn't the one on defense. Chapter 3. The board splinters. Monday came quietly, but it carried the weight of a verdict. The HOA's 7-day deadline had expired, and the clock now ticked toward something Valerie hadn't expected, a lawsuit that could rip apart her carefully curated control over the neighborhood. I knew the board would have to meet again, even if informally, to decide their next step. They'd have to weigh the cost of defending against a federal case, one they were almost certain to lose, against the pride of backing their president. Pride, I'd learned, was expensive, especially when it belonged to people who weren't willing to spend their own money to protect it. The first sign that something was shifting came mid-morning. A plain white envelope appeared in my mailbox. No HOA letterhead this time, no official tone, just a handwritten note from Greg, the treasurer. It was short, careful, and unsigned. He said the board was reviewing all leadership positions and that certain members were concerned about exposure to personal liability. Translation: the board was deal fracturing. It made sense. Most HOA volunteers joined to handle landscaping budgets or organize holiday events, not to become defendants in a civil rights lawsuit. The moment personal risk entered the equation, loyalty to Valerie would evaporate. That afternoon, a neighbor I trusted stopped by while walking her dog. She wasn't the type to gossip, but her tone told me she'd heard something worth sharing. Word was the board had already contacted their insurance provider to ask whether their liability policy would cover damages if they lost in court. The answer had been uncertain at best. By Tuesday, the cracks widened. I noticed Valerie's usual morning. Patrol around the neighborhood was shorter than usual. She didn't linger by driveways or peer over fences. Her gaze still cut in my direction, but it was sharper now, less smug, more calculated. Behind the scenes, my lawyer had received a call from the HOA's newly retained counsel. They asked for an extension on the deadline, claiming they needed time to review all relevant facts. My lawyer refused. The deadline had been clear from the start, and moving it now would only give them space to regroup and attempt another angle of attack. Then came Wednesday. I was out front with Max, tidying up some yard work, when I noticed two board members, people I barely recognized, walking up Valerie's front steps. They weren't there long. When they left, their faces were tight, their words short. Valerie remained inside, blinds drawn. That evening, an email went out to the entire community. It was written in the HOA secretary's voice, not Valerie's, and it announced an emergency closed session of the board to discuss ongoing legal matters. The meeting was set for Friday. My gut told me this was it. Friday came with a heavy gray sky, the kind that hinted at rain but never delivered. I imagined the scene inside the clubhouse, board members seated at the long table, papers spread out, Valerie at the head trying to hold her ground as the others quietly calculated their escape routes. By late afternoon, my lawyer called. His voice carried a note of restrained satisfaction. The HOA's counsel had delivered their official response. They would be rescinding all violation notices, halting any enforcement actions, and issuing a written statement clarifying that Max was permitted under both federal law and the association's governing documents. But the part that made my lawyer pause, made me pause, was the final paragraph. It said the board was in the process of leadership restructuring, and that certain members would no longer be serving in an official capacity. They didn't name her, but I knew exactly who they meant. Still, Valerie wasn't going to vanish quietly. The next morning, I caught sight of her pacing on her porch, phone to her ear, voice sharp enough to carry across the yard. Every so often, she'd glance toward my house, her expression a mixture of fury and disbelief. She had built her identity on being untouchable, the neighborhood's unchallenged enforcer, and now she was watching that identity dissolve in real time. Her remaining supporters, few as they were, tried to keep the story alive. A couple of them posted vague complaints in the neighborhood, his social media group about dangerous animals, and outsiders who don't follow the rules. But the comments didn't land the way they used to. More residents began speaking up, questioning whether the HOA had the right to interfere in personal matters, protected by federal law. It was subtle, but I could feel it. Control was slipping from her hands. By Monday, the change was official. A community-wide email announced the resignation of Valerie Whitford from her role as HOA president, effective immediately. No explanation. No flowery send-off, just a line at the bottom thanking her for her years of service. I read it twice, then looked down at Max, who sat at my feet as if he knew. The air outside felt lighter somehow. The invisible weight of her constant surveillance finally gone. But my lawyer wasn't done. The lawsuit, he reminded me, had been about more than just stopping the harassment. It was about holding them accountable. And while Valerie was gone, the HOA as an entity still had to answer for what they'd done. The next stage wouldn't just end the fight. It would ensure they thought twice before starting another one like it. And for Valerie, the fight wasn't over yet. Because what was coming next would follow her far beyond the borders of this neighborhood. Chapter 4. The courtroom walls close in. The weeks after Valerie's resignation moved with a strange rhythm. Part relief, part anticipation. Without her daily patrols, the neighborhood felt calmer, almost normal. Yet beneath that surface quiet, the legal machinery was still grinding forward, and every day brought me one step closer to holding the HOA accountable in court. My lawyer had filed the lawsuit in federal district court, citing violations of the Americans with Disabilities Act and the Fair Housing Act. The claim was blunt. The HOA had engaged in discriminatory enforcement, targeted a service animal protected by law, and caused measurable harm through harassment and intimidation. The damages we sought weren't symbolic. They were financial, designed to sting. The HOA's legal team responded with the same tired playbook most associations used when cornered. They argued they had acted in good faith to enforce community safety rules. They claimed their misunderstanding about Max's status as a service dog was an unfortunate procedural oversight. But paperwork doesn't erase intent, and the stack of notices, warnings, and thinly veiled threats told a different story. Then came discovery. The process peeled back the HOA's internal communications like a surgeon opening a wound. Emails between board members revealed just how personal Valerie's campaign had been. She hadn't simply received a complaint about Max. She had initiated the complaint, circulated photos of me and my dog without permission, and pushed the board to take swift and visible action to set an example. One message from Valerie to the board stood out. She had written, "If we let him keep that dog, others will think they can ignore the rules too." There was no mention of safety. No concern about behavior, just control. The deposition started shortly after. Each board member had to sit under oath and answer questions. Some were defensive at first, but the cracks showed quickly. Greg, the treasurer, admitted he had warned Valerie about the legal risks early on. The secretary confirmed she had advised against escalating the matter, fearing exactly what had now happened. Both claimed they had felt pressured to go along with Valerie's demands. And then came Valerie's turn. The day she walked into the deposition room, she carried herself like she still held the HOA gavel. But once the court reporter began typing and the questions started, her confidence began to fray. She danced around answers, tried to reframe her actions as neighborhood stewardship. But my lawyer's questions were methodical, relentless. Every evasive answer pushed her deeper into contradictions. She claimed she didn't know Max was a service animal until the lawyer's letter arrived. But the discovery emails showed she had been told twice before sending the first violation notice. She insisted she only acted on complaints, but admitted under questioning that no written complaints existed. By the end of the day, she looked smaller. Not physically, but in presence, like the air of authority she had worn for years had been stripped away, leaving only someone who had overplayed their hand. The HOA's attorneys must have seen the same thing, because within a week they reached out with a settlement offer. It was substantial enough to signal they were worried, but it came with a gag clause meant to keep the details quiet. My lawyer and I declined. Silence would protect them, not me, and certainly not the next homeowner they decided to target. Trial was set for early summer. The weeks leading up to it became a slow tightening of the rope. Witness lists were finalized. Exhibits were prepared. The HOA's insurance company, now fully aware of the risk, pushed them to settle again. But Valerie, still clinging to the idea she could win, urged the board to fight. When the first day of trial arrived, the courtroom was quiet but charged. The HOA's remaining board members sat at one table, dressed neatly but with the look of people who wished they were anywhere else. Valerie sat beside them, her jaw tight, her eyes fixed forward. My side was ready. The judge, a sharp-eyed woman with little patience for wasted time, moved things along quickly. My lawyer opened with a clear narrative. This was not about rules, but about rights, and about a president who had abused her position to target someone she didn't like. The testimony over the next 2 days built the case brick by brick. Neighbors confirmed Max's calm behavior. Experts explained the legal protections for service animals. The emails, projected on a large screen, made the jury shift uncomfortably in their seats. And then, almost poetically, Valerie's own words sealed it. A clip from her deposition, her voice on record, where she admitted, "We can't have exceptions. Rules are rules." Stripped of context, it might have sounded reasonable. But placed next to the ADA's explicit protections, it became the confession of someone who had knowingly broken the law. By the time closing arguments began, the tension in the HOA's corner was palpable. Valerie didn't look at me once. She just stared down at the table, her pen motionless in her hand. When the jury left to deliberate, the room exhaled. And when they returned, their verdict would decide not just my case, but the future of this HOA and Valerie's reputation for years to come. Chapter 5. The Verdict and the Collapse. The jury's absence felt longer than it was. Time has a way of stretching in those moments, when an entire battle hangs in the balance. My lawyer sat calmly, reviewing his notes, but I could feel the faint undercurrent of anticipation in the way he occasionally tapped, his pen against the legal pad. Across the aisle, the HOA's table was tense. Two of the board members whispered to each other, their eyes darting toward the door as if trying to guess what would walk through it. When the bailiff finally announced that the jury had reached a verdict, the room settled into a deep, almost expectant silence. The judge's voice was steady as she called the case back to order. The jury filed in, one by one, their expressions giving nothing away. The foreperson held a folded sheet of paper, and the sound of it being handed to the clerk was the loudest thing in the room. The words came crisp and decisive. The jury found in my favor on every count. The HOA had violated federal law. They had acted with discriminatory intent. They had caused emotional and financial harm. The damages awarded were significant, enough to send a shockwave through their budget and force them into immediate crisis mode. On top of that, the judge added injunctive relief, ordering the HOA to implement policy changes, training, and monitoring to ensure no other residents' rights would be violated in the future. But the most satisfying part wasn't the money or the policies. It was the finding of willful misconduct against Valerie personally. That single line in the verdict meant she was not shielded by the HOA's insurance. She would be responsible for her portion of the damages. The color drained from her face when she heard it, and for the first time in months, she looked directly at me, not with defiance, but with something closer to disbelief. The HOA's attorney requested a recess, likely to discuss an appeal, but my lawyer knew the terrain well. An appeal would only prolong the inevitable and cost them more than they could afford. Within a week, they filed their intent to settle in full rather than drag the matter further. The check arrived 2 weeks later, heavy not just in amount, but in what it symbolized. The neighborhood's reaction was almost as telling as the verdict itself. For years, Valerie had ruled the HOA like a private fiefdom, her word carrying more weight than the bylaws. Now, whispers followed her wherever she went. Some neighbors openly celebrated the outcome, quietly thanking me for standing up where they had been too afraid to. Others kept their distance, perhaps wary of getting caught in the fallout. The board moved quickly to distance itself from her. A special meeting was called, and without ceremony, Valerie was formally removed from her position. No farewell speeches, no polite applause, just a vote, a declaration, and the sound of a gavel signaling the end of her reign. Financially, the blow to the HOA was severe. The settlement drained a large portion of their reserve fund, forcing them to postpone planned community projects and cut back on non-essential spending. The legal fees alone were enough to raise questions about whether certain board members might also be replaced at the next election. Valerie's personal finances took a visible hit. She sold her luxury SUV within a month. The manicured front lawn that had once been her pride began to look less pristine. I never learned the exact details of her repayment plan, but the rumors suggested it was stretching her resources thin. The most ironic twist came quietly. The new HOA president, in compliance with the court's orders, instituted a residents' rights policy that explicitly outlined protections for service animals, complete with a training seminar for all board members. I received a printed copy in my mailbox, as required by the injunction. The policy bore the HOA's official letterhead, and in the lower right corner, Valerie's old signature still adorned the template. I framed it and hung it in my home office, not out of spite, but as a reminder. But the story didn't end with the verdict or the policy changes. Something in the power dynamics of the neighborhood had shifted, and cracks were beginning to form in places I hadn't anticipated. Valerie might have been removed from office, but she wasn't ready to disappear quietly. I started hearing from neighbors that she had been spreading a new story, one where she was the victim, painted as the target of a personal vendetta, rather than the architect of her own downfall. And while most people dismissed her version, a handful seemed willing to believe it. It wasn't hard to see where this could lead. I had won the legal battle, but Valerie still had her voice, her connections, and just enough stubbornness to cause trouble if she chose. The question was whether she'd settle for the damage already done, or try to claw back what she'd lost. Chapter 6. The Last Move and the Final Silence. The months following the trial should have been quiet. The verdict had been decisive, the settlement paid, and the HOA had been forced into compliance with new policies. On paper, the matter was over. But in neighborhoods like ours, grudges are rarely filed away as neatly as court documents. Valerie had lost her official authority, but she hadn't lost her stubbornness. She began working the back channels, meeting with the few remaining allies she had, walking door to door under the guise of checking in on the community and telling her own rewritten version of events. In her story, she was the brave resident who had tried to protect her neighbors from a dangerous animal, only to be ambushed by an overzealous lawyer and a biased court. At first, it was just noise, whispers overheard at the mailbox, a cold glance from someone I barely knew. But then small, deliberate inconveniences began to appear. My trash cans were mysteriously knocked over more than once. HOA maintenance crews, despite the new policies, somehow overlooked my property during routine services. Mail arrived late or not at all. It was petty juvenile harassment, but it carried the clear fingerprint of someone who hadn't let go. I could have ignored it. But ignoring Valerie was like letting weeds grow in your garden. Give them a little time, and they'll take over. So I documented everything. Every toppled trash can, every skipped lawn trimming, every late letter. Photos, timestamps, even small notes about suspicious vehicles idling at the corner of my street. My lawyer encouraged it. Not because I planned to sue again right away, but because he knew, like I did, that people like Valerie rarely stop until they trip over their own arrogance. The breaking point came one early autumn evening. The air was crisp, leaves scattering in gusts along the pavement, when I pulled into my driveway to see a county animal control vehicle parked out front. A uniformed officer stood waiting, clipboard in hand, his expression unreadable. He explained that a complaint had been filed, claiming my German Shepherd had attacked a child in the neighborhood. The words were like a bad joke. My dog was a certified service animal, trained to remain calm even under stress. But I didn't argue emotionally. I argued with evidence. I walked the officer to the backyard, where my dog rested quietly on his bed, head tilted, tail gently wagging. Then I showed the officer the service animal certification, vaccination records, and, most importantly, the high-definition security footage from my property's cameras. The footage was damning, not for me, but for whoever had made the complaint. It clearly showed my dog in the yard the entire day, never leaving the property, never coming into contact with any child. The officer's professionalism never cracked, but there was a subtle change in his posture, quiet acknowledgement that he'd seen this kind of thing before. Before he left, he mentioned almost offhand that filing a false report to animal control was a criminal offense in the county. His tone told me he knew exactly what was going on. That was the moment Valerie had gone too far. The very next morning, a sheriff's deputy knocked on her door. From my porch, I could see the scene unfold like a slow, inevitable play. She answered wearing her usual air of superiority, arms crossed, eyes narrowed. But her expression shifted in stages. First confusion, then defensive outrage, and finally, the unmistakable tightening of someone who realizes they've made a serious mistake. The deputy left with a signed notice in hand. By the afternoon, the rumor mill was grinding at full speed. Valerie was under investigation for filing a false report, harassment, and violating the injunction that came with our lawsuit settlement. It didn't take long for the walls to close in. My lawyer handed over our meticulous documentation to the sheriff's office, along with the security footage and witness statements from several neighbors, who had quietly grown tired of her behavior. By the start of winter, Valerie faced misdemeanor charges and a civil contempt hearing. The fines weren't ruinous, but they were enough to sting, and the record would follow her. Any remnants of support she once had in the neighborhood evaporated almost overnight. People she'd considered allies no longer waved from across the street. No one came to her defense online or in person. She had burned too many bridges, and the smoke was still hanging over her. The last time I saw her was on a windy Tuesday morning. She was loading boxes into the trunk of a used sedan, her once perfectly manicured appearance dulled by exhaustion. Her house had been listed quietly, without the grand announcement she'd once insisted on for other sales. There was no farewell gathering, no committee to see her off, just the hollow thud of her car door closing and the slow roll of her tires toward the neighborhood. Exit she'd once patrolled like a queen. Life after Valerie felt lighter. The HOA, perhaps humbled by the ordeal, operated more transparently. Board meetings stayed on topic. Decisions were grounded in actual community needs, and the hostility that once lingered like a fog began to clear. My service dog, still as calm, loyal, and disciplined as ever, was greeted warmly by name when we walked the neighborhood, even by people who'd once kept their distance. I kept the framed residents' rights policy on my office wall, not as a trophy, but as a quiet reminder that bullies often believe their power is permanent until someone makes the rules matter. Valerie had thought she could bend the law to her will, but in the end it was her own arrogance that broke her. And sometimes, the most satisfying victory isn't just winning in court, it's watching the lights go out in the house of someone who thought they could never be touched. Knowing you didn't just defend yourself, you changed the rules for everyone who comes after. Thanks for watching today's story. If you enjoyed this episode of drama, justice, and sweet revenge, make sure to hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow and keeps these stories coming. Every view, comment, and share lets us know you're loving the content, and we couldn't do it without your amazing support. If you've ever dealt with an HOA nightmare, a pushy neighbor, or a situation where someone thought they could walk all over you, share your experience down in the comments. We read every single one, and you might even see your story featured in a future video. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications, so you never miss a moment of these jaw-dropping real-life tales. We post new episodes every week, packed with unbelievable twists, courtroom showdowns, and satisfying endings you'll want to replay again and again. Thanks again for being part of this incredible community. Your support makes all the difference. Stay strong, stand your ground, and remember, sometimes the best revenge is just letting the truth win.